Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we focus our attention on Gaza and Israel. And this is a topic, as you all know, that has been very important to us because of the magnitude of the events that are taking place in that part of the world. I want to start, however, not with Gaza today, but with Ukraine. This week marks the third anniversary of the special military operation conducted by the Russian government into Ukraine to secure Crimea. I don't want to talk about the particulars of that war or that conflict. What I'd like to dwell on is a common denominator between what we are witnessing around Ukraine and what we are witnessing around Gaza. And I do so because it's so important for all of us to understand how the news media seeks to manipulate how we think. We approach the media when we want the news. We just want to know what's happening. But what we get when we watch the news is not what's happening. It's what the prevailing elites want us to believe about what's happening. And I want to parse this in the following way. With the advent of the Trump administration, a whole new approach is underway in terms of the war in Ukraine, more broadly, NATO's relationship to Ukraine, NATO's relationship to Russia, more fundamentally still, the United States' relationship with Russia that was starkly implemented yesterday in the vote of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which was contemplating a resolution that last year was boilerplate to condemn the Russian invasion and the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And yesterday, the United States joined Russia and North Korea to vote against the resolution. And what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is a complete meltdown in Europe, in the mainstream press, in the United States, talking about how Trump has betrayed the Ukrainians, how Trump is now sort of channeling Vladimir Putin, and how Trump is sacrificing the Ukrainians for Russian aggression. First of all, nothing is further from the truth. And secondly, what is happening between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is what routinely took place from 1945 to 1991. Whatever the tensions between the United States and Russia, then the Soviet Union, till it collapsed in 1991, virtually every president had multiple summits with the Russians. President Nixon had détente with Leonid Brezhnev. There were multiple treaties and protocols limiting the nuclear threat while the Soviet Union was still communist and the United States was still capitalist. And then something very strange happened. which I've talked about many, many times. And that is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the neoconservatives, the neocons in the United States, gained the ascendancy for the first time and decided that even though the Soviet Union was no longer there and Russia was no longer communist, because they were dedicated to full spectrum dominance, this is important for Israel. They wanted to move NATO to the east. They wanted to break up Russia. They wanted to subordinate China. And they wanted the United States to enjoy its unipolar moment for 1,000 years. Summits basically stopped, except at meetings when various presidents would meet Vladimir Putin. And under President Biden, there were no summits at all. Because what happened was peace, normal relations became a dirty word, became something that if you talked about normalizing with Russia, if you talked about who's really responsible for the Ukraine war, you were considered a mouthpiece of Vladimir Putin, even though a rising crescendo of commentators, including Jack Matlock, the final ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union, Jeffrey Sachs and many people, John Mersheimer, were saying that peace is possible. We just have to go back to the way it was before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And for the United States to stop thinking that it had to control the world. And as I've said before, this is what's happening with Donald Trump now. A recognition that the unipolar moment of the United States is over, that full spectrum dominance is absurdity in the face of Russia and China and the growing power of the BRICS. And yet, because Europe, the mainstream media, the political class has become so addicted to war and this notion of US supremacy that even though Trump is doing the obvious, sitting down with the Russians in Riyadh and talking about normalizing relations, getting rid of sanctions, establishing trade across a variety of key industrial areas, and bringing this war to a close. It is considered radical and controversial. That construct is what shapes our perception and the media deliveries about Israel. Israel also believes in full spectrum dominance, that the Israeli state, the Jewish people, have the right to all that land. And nobody's going to stand in their way, so that the parallelism between Zionism and neoconservatism is exactly the same mentality. It's really important for people to understand that it's that mentality that is shaping these events. So that even if you question Zionism, you question the right of Israel to have all of Palestine, you're considered anti-Semitic. I can't tell you how many times I've been charged with being anti-Semitic and that I'm a mouthpiece for Putin. By simply elevating the dialogue to a greater scope so that we can see that war is not necessary if we change the construct of what it is that we're seeking to achieve. Marco Rubio is the first Secretary of State in history to talk about multipolarity and that the unipolarity is no longer relevant in our world. And it was Donald Trump that began the process of a ceasefire in the Middle East, because I think instinctively he's seeking to calm the geostrategic and international relations by calling for a 50% reduction in the nuclear weapons and a reduction in military spending between the United States and Russia and China, which the Russians have agreed is a worthy goal, and the Chinese with more hesitation because their budgets are minuscule compared to that of the United States. So when we consider Gaza today and we consider what's going on in the Middle East, let us hold a framework that peace is possible, even though in the last 24 hours, it's been reported that 6 more babies and young children have frozen to death in Gaza. One little baby called Sham was only 6 days old because the Israelis are refusing to allow humanitarian relief in any meaningful way to come into Gaza and are doing everything they can to jeopardize the ceasefire and the peace process. And so we need to understand that this context within which we've considered foreign policy for the last 30 years now, 35 years, is beginning to break down, and many people are very uncomfortable with this emerging new reality. And part of what we need to do, in my view, is to midwife and nurture this new mentality within the context of which peace is no longer a dirty word. And normalization, whether it's between Russia and the United States, Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Europe, the Israelis and the Palestinians, that in fact, that is a desirable goal and it is achievable. So thank you everyone for joining us here on Humanity Rising.